It was September 3rd, 1976, at the Houston Astrodome in Texas. The massive stadium, known as the eighth wonder of the world, had been transformed into the largest concert venue Elvis had ever performed in, with 28,000 passionate fans packed into every available seat, from the field level to the uppermost reaches of the dome. The late summer heat outside was oppressive at 97 degrees, but inside the air-conditioned stadium, the atmosphere was electric with the energy of what was being billed as the biggest indoor concert in Texas history. Elvis was in the middle of delivering a powerful emotional performance when disaster struck in the most public way possible. His microphone went completely dead, cutting off his voice at the climactic moment of his most popular song. What happened next would demonstrate why the King of Rock and Roll had earned that title through more than just vocal ability. The microphone failure occurred at the worst possible moment. Elvis was building toward the dramatic crescendo of a song that had the entire stadium on their feet, singing along with passionate intensity. His voice had been soaring with power and emotion, filling every corner of the massive venue with the kind of magnetic performance that had made him a global icon. Then suddenly, silence. Complete, devastating silence where Elvis's voice should have been. The technical failure was absolute. Not only did Elvis's handheld microphone die, but the backup systems that should have automatically engaged also failed to function. In an instant, the most important voice in popular music was rendered inaudible to 28,000 people who had traveled from across Texas and beyond to hear him perform. For a split second, Elvis stood frozen on the stage, his mouth moving but no sound emerging from the arena's massive sound system. The crowd, initially confused by the sudden absence of their hero's voice, began to murmur with concern and disappointment. Technical problems at concerts were not uncommon, but a complete microphone failure during the peak moment of Elvis's biggest song was a performer's worst nightmare. Most entertainers would have stopped the performance, signaled to their crew for technical assistance, or made gestures to indicate they were experiencing equipment problems. The logical response would have been to wait for the sound engineers to solve the problem or to bring a replacement microphone from backstage. But Elvis Presley had built his career on connecting with audiences in ways that transcended the ordinary, and his response to this crisis would prove why he was considered the greatest live performer of his generation. Instead of stopping or waiting for help, Elvis did something that no one in that stadium expected. He threw the dead microphone aside with a gesture of theatrical dismissal, stepped to the very edge of the stage, cupped his hands around his mouth, and began projecting his voice using nothing but natural vocal power and the acoustics of the domed stadium. His voice, trained through years of performing in venues of all sizes and acoustic conditions, cut through the vast space of the Astrodome with surprising clarity and power. Without amplification, without electronic assistance of any kind, Elvis continued the song exactly where it had left off, his natural vocal projection carrying his voice to sections of the stadium that seemed impossibly far away. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. The initial disappointment and concern transformed into amazement and then into wild appreciation as 28,000 people realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a technical recovery. This was a demonstration of raw vocal power and professional skill that few performers could have managed under any circumstances. Elvis moved across the stage with deliberate theatrical gestures, using his entire body to help project his voice and maintain visual connection with audience members in the farthest seats. His years of experience performing in small clubs before the era of sophisticated sound systems had taught him techniques for vocal projection that most modern performers had never needed to develop. What made the moment even more remarkable was how Elvis transformed the technical disaster into an opportunity for unprecedented audience interaction. Without amplification, the usual barrier between performer and audience dissolved. People in the closer sections could actually have conversations with Elvis, and his responses could be heard by those around them, creating pockets of intimate connection within the massive venue. "Y'all still with me?" Elvis shouted to the crowd, his voice carrying clearly through the domed space. The roar of approval that answered him was deafening, 28,000 voices expressing their amazement and support for what they were witnessing. Elvis then did something that turned the technical crisis into one of the most interactive concerts in rock and roll history. He began conducting different sections of the stadium, using hand gestures and body language to encourage various parts of the audience to sing different vocal parts of the songs. The upper deck became his backing vocalists, the field-level seats his rhythm section, clapping and stomping, and the middle sections his lead harmony singers. Without any electronic amplification, Elvis was conducting a choir of 28,000 people, creating arrangements and harmonies that had never existed in his studio recordings. The acoustics of the Astrodome, designed for football games and large events, actually worked in Elvis's favor. The dome shape helped carry sound throughout the venue, and the collective voices of 28,000 people singing together created a wall of sound that was more powerful than any electric amplification could have provided. Between songs, Elvis shared stories and jokes with the audience, his voice now carrying easily through the stadium as both he and the crowd had adjusted to this new, more intimate dynamic. He talked about his early days performing in small venues where microphones were luxuries rather than necessities, and about how some of his most memorable performances had happened when technology failed, but human connection succeeded. "You know what, folks?" Elvis called out, his voice strong and clear without amplification. "Sometimes the best music happens when all the fancy equipment gets out of the way and it's just people making music together. Tonight, y'all aren't just my audience, you're my band." The crowd erupted in appreciation, understanding that they were participating in something that could never be replicated. This wasn't just a concert anymore. It was a collaborative musical experience that challenged traditional boundaries between performer and audience. Sound technicians were working frantically backstage to restore the microphone systems, but Elvis seemed to be enjoying the unique circumstances too much to want the equipment fixed quickly. He was feeding off the energy of direct, unfiltered connection with his audience in a way that amplified performances couldn't match. When backup microphones were finally brought on stage, nearly 20 minutes after the original failure, Elvis looked at them with theatrical skepticism. "Now, are these things going to work?" he asked the crowd, "or are we having more fun doing it the old-fashioned way?" The crowd's response was unanimous. They wanted to continue the acoustic experience. 28,000 people were having more fun participating in the music creation than they had ever had passively consuming amplified performances. Elvis spent the next several songs alternating between using the restored microphones and setting them aside to perform acoustically, creating dynamic contrasts that kept the audience engaged and amazed. When he used amplification, it felt like a special effect. When he performed acoustically, it felt like pure, authentic music. The climax of this unprecedented performance came when Elvis decided to perform his closing number entirely without amplification, conducting the entire stadium in a mass sing-along that transformed 28,000 individual voices into one unified instrument. The sound was overwhelming, not loud in the harsh way that amplified music can be, but full and rich and organic in a way that touched people's hearts rather than just their ears. As the song built to its conclusion, Elvis spread his arms wide, encouraging every person in the stadium to sing as loudly as they could. The resulting sound was unlike anything anyone present had ever experienced. 28,000 voices joined together in perfect unity, creating harmonies that seemed to make the very structure of the Astrodome vibrate with musical energy. When the song ended, the silence that followed was profound and respectful. Then slowly, the applause began. Not the usual screaming excitement of a rock concert, but something deeper and more emotional. People were crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of what they had just participated in creating. The standing ovation lasted for 12 minutes, with Elvis acknowledging the crowd's appreciation while also directing applause back toward them, recognizing their role in creating something extraordinary. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said when the applause finally died down, "tonight you weren't just my audience. Tonight you were my partners in making music, and what we created together was more beautiful than anything I could have done alone." The microphone failure concert, as it came to be known, became legendary among Elvis fans and music historians. It was cited as the definitive example of how genuine artistry can triumph over technical difficulties, and how the most meaningful musical experiences often happen when technology steps aside to allow pure human connection. Bootleg recordings of that evening became some of the most treasured Elvis performances in existence, not because of their technical quality. Much of the acoustic performance was difficult to capture clearly, but because they documented something that could never happen again, the sound of 28,000 people discovering the power of their own voices, guided by one of the greatest performers in music history. Elvis himself often referenced that Houston concert in later interviews, describing it as one of the most important performances of his career. "That night reminded me why I started singing in the first place," he would say. "It wasn't about the microphones or the lights or any of the fancy equipment. It was about connecting with people through music and letting them know that their voices matter too." The story of the Astrodome microphone failure serves as a reminder that authentic artistry doesn't depend on technology, that the most powerful musical experiences often involve active participation rather than passive consumption, and that great performers are defined not by their equipment, but by their ability to connect with people in any circumstances. Elvis Presley proved that night that his title as the King of Rock and Roll was based on much more than vocal ability or stage presence. It was based on his understanding that music is fundamentally about human connection, and that the greatest performances happen when artists and audiences come together as collaborators in creating something beautiful. And 28,000 people learned something that night about their own power as musical beings, that they didn't need expensive equipment or professional training to participate in creating transcendent musical experiences. They just needed voices, courage, and a great leader who understood that the best music happens when everyone gets to contribute to the magic.